Danielle Sullivan, a wonderful, wonderful human being. What a conversation. She's autistic. She didn't get diagnosed until she was in her 30s. Her son, was diagnosed at a young age. She runs a podcast, a wonderful podcast uh, that she talks about it, neurodiverging, and she talks about autism. We talk about, on the spectrum. Is that a flattering term? The different levels of autism. My partner's son is autistic, and I talk a little bit about interactions with him. He doesn't quite understand sarcasm, and I certainly dwell there. But it's a fascinating relationship. But Danielle does a great job of breaking it down, explaining the differences. Not worse, not better, just different, and how the community operates and how it's getting better. There's so many misconceptions throughout the years of autism. She runs a Patreon where she helps others. She does coaching. Just a wonderful, wonderful human being. I'm going to be subscribing to her Patreon. I'll put it in the notes. Neurodiverging.com. It's at Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and Patreon. Her view on discipline is absolutely astounding. I I, I never heard this before. Autism and discipline. Absolutely fascinating when that took a turn and how she views it. Really great conversation with Danielle Sullivan. I absolutely loved it. You will as well. Thanks for listening. Hi, I'm Joey Pinz. People ask me, how did I lose 130 pounds? The quick answer is always discipline. I started my business, wasn't paying attention to my health, was eating too much, drinking too much sweets. My daughter was born. Next thing I know, I'm pre-diabetic, I have hypertension. I knew something had to change. Discipline. I, like many of you, have faced many challenges in your career, in your family, in your life, in your faith. How did you attack them? How did you approach them? How did you solve them, hopefully? It all had to have some degree of discipline. I'm also asked, how did you found and start a tech business that lasted over 25 years? Discipline. I was committed to it, enjoyed technology, didn't enjoy some aspects of it, but knew it was necessary. Discipline. Our podcast mission: how do we use discipline to better ourselves and society? Join me, please, as I talk to interesting people and discuss how they use discipline in their family, in their passion, in their careers, and how it helped them. Our podcast vision: growth through learning from others. Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. It'll be light and serious. Join us, please. Thank you for consideration. And I'm excited to learn more about it. Danielle, thank you so much for your time. Danielle Sullivan. So, what is neurodiversity?
Ooh, you're getting right into
Yeah.
it. Okay. So, neurodiversity is a kind of a big word that we use to describe anybody who has a brain that functions
Mm.
differently than the sort of typical. So, right away, there's this binary of we have a typical brain and a non
Mm.
typical brain. Basically, we're looking at folks who are, can be born with a difference, right? Like are autistic, ADHD, have Down syndrome, have any other kind of change in how their brain is functioning, or somebody who acquires a neurodiversity maybe through a concussion or a fall or
Mm.
something, or stroke, right? So the brain has changed function to how it was before after they have healed. In So from a medical standpoint, that's neurodiversity. From my standpoint, as a like in social
Mm.
spaces, neurodiversity will often refer just to people who are autistic, ADHD, have executive function challenges, um, and who are basically different in some way in how we function in a way that can't be like healed by taking a
Mm.
medicine or going on antidepressants or doing some kind of therapy, right? The function of the brain is just always going to be different. not bad or good. It just is.
It's just different. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you didn't get officially diagnosed until your 30s.
Hmm. That's very
You
true.
struggled in high school. I shouldn't say you struggled. You had difficulty in high
I
school.
struggled.
Yeah,
It's
it
fair.
struggled. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You felt kind of out of place, and so
Mhm.
why get diagnosed in your 30s?
Well, I think there's many ways I could answer this question. So my kiddos were
Mm,
diagnosed when they were very young, and that led me to coming to this understanding that I was neurodivergent. Before then, I was just a quote unquote weird person. Like I knew I didn't fit in. I knew I wasn't following people's conversations. I knew that my social cues were off, but I just understood myself as on my own a very difficult person. So I was difficult. It wasn't that I had a different brain and there were other people like me. So coming to the realization of being neurodivergent and being autistic and saying, oh, there's all these other autistic adults in the world. I'm not the weird
mm.
one. I'm just in this other group over here. So for me, coming to that space of diagnosis was really about affirming my identity and affirming that I'm, like a normal person, but just in this other section of normal over here, you know?
Did your life change after you were diagnosed?
Yeah, pretty radically. There's a lot about, so I'm an autistic person. There's a lot about being autistic that is not well understood by kind of the general
Mm,
population, and that we're still coming to understand now. There's not a ton of research still on a condition that affects many, 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 many people. And I was, before I was diagnosed, having really significant problems. I had been misdiagnosed with anxiety. I had been misdiagnosed with depression. I had been misdiagnosed with the postpartum depression, the baby blues, right? I was having what in autism we refer to as shutdowns, where I just could not function for hours every day. I was in bed for hours in the dark by myself every
mm.
day with like as many blankets on top of me as I possibly
Wow.
could. I was not functional in the very basic sense. And once it was determined that I was autistic, it was like there's a whole amount of literature and advice from other people and resources that open up that are like, oh, you're not just non-functional, you're having
Mm.
shutdowns, you're being overstimulated. So learning about sensory overwhelm, learning about pressure and how occupational therapy can support, learning what my triggers were for hitting overwhelm, that enabled me to make positive changes in my day-to-day
Mm.
existence that now I haven't had one of those periods in, I don't know, years, but it was literally every day when
Wow.
my children were young. I just couldn't make it through the day. So it really had a huge, I would say, profound effect on me. It was a very positive change in my life, that diagnosis.
Because you didn't know why, you didn't understand, and you felt you were the only one. And now that
Hmm.
you were diagnosed, you're all of a sudden in a family, you're in a group of people, and it's easier to relate.
Yeah, and it's easier to learn more about it
Mm,
and to try new things because there's also the kind of second layer of being misdiagnosed. If what I was going through was labeled as anxiety and depression, there's a treatment plan for those
mm,
things, right? And ideally, many folks improve on that treatment plan. But if you're autistic, and being treated for depression and anxiety, there's no improvement because anxiety and depression are not the problem. The problem is all these other stuff that's going on. So having the correct label in this case allowed me to pursue the correct course of support, right? We don't treat autism. Autism doesn't need to be
right,
treated in the sense that we're trying to fix it,
right.
right? But there are different ways that you might need to organize your life to live well with autism. And you need the understanding of what you're going through in order to be able to make those changes effectively. Yeah.
Is the term on the spectrum, is that supportive?
Different autistic people believe differently about
Mm,
it. So I can really only speak for myself. I think many in the autism community feel like it's a little bit like what's so wrong with just saying you have autism or
I
you're
see.
autistic, right? So it feels a little bit like you're hedging around the
Mm,
thing. And some folks feel that using on the spectrum can contribute to kind of negative
right.
stereotypes of autism, like if we can't even say it, we can't even say autism, then how are we going to like treat people who are autistic fairly and equally and all those things. Some folks really love the on the spectrum idea. They think it really encompasses all the differences and all the the wide variety that you see in autism. And so I think there's both sides. Um, I'm a little bit on the side of, I think, I don't judge people based on vocabulary they use. I think we just need to communicate and not worry so much about little bits. But that there's nothing wrong with saying autistic, and I tend toward just going with that because it's very clear, it's very direct, and it lets people know it's okay to
Mm.
say. So yeah,
I could see how, yeah, it could be taken as condescending because you're afraid to say the
that's a good
word,
word.
you
Hmm.
know. But then there's very different degrees. So how should what should non-autistic people,
Hmm.
how should they work better and support the autistic community?
So the first thing I will always say is that wherever you are in the world, you have an autistic
Mm,
community somewhere, and that might be a formal, like, autism support group, adult autistic support group, kid autistic support group, or it might be an informal, there are three autistic adults that live in your town, right? But the first thing that really will help is getting to know the autistic people in your
mm,
community. And that might be, nowadays, that might be the people in your Discord community, right? It may not be in your physical location. But actually getting to know folks who are dealing with this day to day and understanding what they need, right? Because it will be different depending on where you are and what's going on for them. Um, the other thing I would say is this goes for broadly for anybody who's disabled, is just to try to listen to us when we try to tell you that something is not working,
mm,
right? A lot of us, especially people like me who are caught later, are very used to our diagnosis being kind of pushed aside, like, oh, you can't really be autistic because look, you are quote unquote functional, right? You're a parent, you have a job, you eat your dinner every day, whatever it is. And it's like, well, I might present that way, but yeah, sometimes I fail to eat my dinner because I'm in sensory overload.
mm.
And so believing what we're telling you about our problems and our concerns and where we're struggling and what we could use to help us better instead of trying to make a decision based on your understanding of the world. Our understandings are different. And so just getting in a place where you can curiously ask questions and listen to the answers and try to be supportive. It's very basic, but it really helps a lot.
Yeah, just open-mindedness and being
Hmm.
accepting. My girlfriend's son
Hmm.
is autistic, and Nolan's a wonderful young man. One of the quick things you learn is that doesn't understand sarcasm,
Yep. Yep.
of which I tend to, dwell. So
Hmm.
I remember one particular time we came back from shopping, and Nolan, of course, wants to help, very cooperative. And I said, Nolan, can you take this salmon? And I bought some salmon. He said, sure. I said,
Hmm.
be careful, don't let it swim away. And Nolan said, Joe, I think we're past that point.
That's really cute.
So wonderful young man, but it's just operates a little bit differently. Did you see Love on the Spectrum on Netflix?
I have not. I have heard many things about it,
Ah,
but I actually have trouble with live television or that style of television sometimes. And I'm face blind, which is common in autistic people. I have a lot of trouble um, with yeah, shows where I can't tell the people apart.
interesting.
Um, and a lot of American shows, all the people look the same. So I kind of steer away from it. But
I've never heard
yeah,
that.
I'm sorry to
I've never
say.
heard that. Face
Oh,
blind.
yeah.
Yeah.
Very common. Yeah. It's got a fancy long name that I would butcher if I tried to say it. No, I'm not going to be able to do it. It starts with PROSP. Um, and it's it's common across the population regardless of neurotype, but it's more common, it seems like, in autistic people and people with a couple of other different neurotypes. And it can range from mild all the way to severe, being like, oh, you can kind of recognize some faces, you're okay at it, but you're not great. And then people who just like can't envision faces in their head. And I'm in the moderate sense. So if you're if I usually see you at the grocery store and you're somewhere else, I won't know who you are until I hear you talk.
Interesting.
Um, I have trouble remembering what people look like. If I can memorize your earrings or your shoes or something specific about you, and I do memorize voices pretty quickly, then I'll be fine. But if you change anything about your appearance, I suddenly don't know who you are. So
Wow.
my son's like that too. Yeah.
Very interesting. Well, in the show, it just it brings some some autistic people in Australia, and they follow them
Yeah.
along and they go on dates, but you just kind of as an a non-autistic audience or person watching, you just get more of an appreciation of what it's like, and they describe their feelings, and it's
Yeah.
a nice it's a nice insight. Now your son is was diagnosed. Now tell me about that. Did you
Mhm.
see signs and want to get him tested? How did you discover this?
Yeah, it was so my son had significant ear infections when he was very young, and so he was speech delayed. This is also apparently common. I found out later among autistic
Really?
people um, that we all have a lot of us have speech delays. Some of us have ear infections. They may or may not be connected. I apparently was also speech delayed as a child, which I didn't find out till later.
I'm sorry, Danielle,
Um,
you're saying
and
speech glaze?
speech
Oh,
delayed.
speech
Delayed.
delayed.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm just speaking too quickly, so you can call me on
No,
that
it's okay.
anytime. Speech delayed as a child. We also sometimes use weird syntax, and I know I am really bad at
Hmm,
that. So if I say something that doesn't make sense, you can ask. I will not. You cannot offend
thank
me.
you.
I'm used to it. So I had speech delays. My son had speech delays. We weren't sure if it was the ear infection or not, so we went and did all the testing. Um, he also like his fine motor control was fine. His gross motor um came in sort of weird, like he went in a weird order.
Wow.
He didn't learn to crawl until after he was already walking. um he didn't learn to sit until he was like mostly crawling. So his kind of order of development was
Hmm,
different than is typical, which can be an indication of autism. Not always. Sometimes babies are just babies, but and then he had the big speech delays, which can also be an indication. And then we noticed that he wasn't following pointing gestures. He wasn't noticing gestures, and his eye contact was a little different than many kiddos. Um, Now, in retrospect, I'm like, was his eye contact and his gestures off because I, as his mother, don't use them
mm,
typically, quote unquote, typically? But we didn't have that reference point at the time. So we were sort of like, well, he's got all these signs. Let's get him evaluated. And so we went in and did the evaluation, and they came back with autistic. So it wasn't a huge surprise by that
hmm.
point because we had been doing the research on our own and kind of looking at what could be causing the speech delays. Um, it does sound like speech glaze. That's interesting.
Well, we're also on,
Yeah.
the mics and, yeah,
Oh, yeah. All the things
sure,
in
sure, the
between
technology
you and
between
me.
us, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, so that was what prompted us to get him evaluated. But in doing all the research to figure out, like, should I go through this evaluation process? Because it is a big ask for a little kid.
Mm,
It's a big process, and it's stressful for the parents too, and it costs a lot of money. So there's
is it
lots
really?
of potential negatives. So in trying to figure out, well, should we do this? Should we do this? Um, I had done all this research and started to realize, like, oh, it's not just him, it's probably me, and it's probably these other members of my extended family as well, you know? So um, it was overall a very valuable process to go through.
And after learning that sense of, okay, a sense of ease now, I understand much better. We
Hmm.
know what to do from this point forward, similar to when you were diagnosed.
Yeah, I will say that I found the process a little bit not disconcerting. So the folks who evaluated him were excellent individual people,
Mm,
and they had a lot of expertise in their fields. They wanted the best for the kiddos that they were working with. But when they kind of came to this conclusion and we sat down for the meeting and they were like, yeah, he's autistic, their whole tone and approach was very like his, it was like getting a stage 4 cancer diagnosis or something. It was very down. It was very like, your son is autistic. He will be autistic for life. He will never be non autistic. It was very dramatic.
wow.
And I'm sitting here going, like, having done a lot of research and being like, yeah, that's fine. Like, we just want it. It's not like we're coming in not expecting him to be autistic. Um, so sometimes at least with children, my diagnosis was very different. But at least with children, sometimes the process, I think, can be scary for parents who have no background and haven't done any research, haven't done any, um, or maybe don't have the resources or the education to do
Mm.
research in a way that gives them good information. Um, because I knew enough to be able to say, like, no, I don't really agree that this is a death sentence. I think we'll be fine, but thank you. But a lot of parents, I think, get sat down and told by, a psychiatrist with how many years experience, like, your kid is going to have significant troubles in life. And in some cases, that is true. And I'm not trying to downplay that. But the troubles aren't going to cause the child, in most cases, to like be a total outcast who can never have any joy and never be well and never like have a good life. Um, so yeah. So my experience of my kiddo's diagnosis was not the most positive
Mm.
in ways that I'm not super happy about still.
You do such a great job on your podcast, Neurodiverging, and one particular one that I enjoyed where you talk about just that, about how you can go
Mm,
about getting the diagnosis, and you make a point that there are many different doctors that can do it. You should choose this one, and you make the point that you're not a doctor. This is
mm.
your opinion.
Yeah, I'm just a
It's just a
coach.
coach, yeah. But you make the point that they should, and you want to talk about that. That was great. It was great the way you set that up.
Sure. Was it specifically about child diagnosis or adult
Just get how
autism
to get
diagnosis?
diagnosis, who you should go to get
Oh,
diagnosis.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah,
I've talked so much on that
you do a great
podcast at
job.
this point
Great
that
job.
who knows? I'm glad you like it. So I generally recommend that people go get diagnosed by other autistic professionals if
Mm,
possible. So there are lots of and this is not meant to be exclusionary. There are lots of non-autistic professionals who are working very hard to support autistic people. Um, that said, there's a lot of misinformation and just bad research, like frankly, just bad research about autism, what autism looks like, especially in adults, especially in people of color,
mm,
especially in immigrant populations, and especially in women or basically non men, anyone who's not a man
mm,
and not a white man. All the research that we have from the 80s and earlier is really based in a population, a very small population of white boys. And so anybody who's not a white boy is often not served by those particular studies. And that's starting to be understood in the research community, and we're starting to get better evaluation tools that are specifically geared towards, people who are not white, people who are not men, people who are not American. But the initial tools we had and that professionals were using are they have some problems. And so if you can go be diagnosed by somebody else who is autistic, they're much likely to have not only the research background but the lived
mm.
experience to be able to ask you the right questions to figure out if you fit in that diagnosis or not. Because the other thing is that there's a lot of overlapping um, traits between autism and other kinds of neurodivergences. And so if you're not sure, it is good to like go talk to a professional person because you might not be autistic, you might have something else going on. Um, but you do want to make sure you're working with somebody who really gets your specific population and your specific gender and sex, your specific where you come from kind of details because it's important.
Yeah, and you do a really good job again on the podcast doing that. Another thing that you struggled with that you talk very openly on the podcast was um, homeschooling versus public schooling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, you make the point of saying if you're going to homeschool, that's okay, but please do not forget about the ones who can't afford to be homeschooled that are in the public
Mm-hmm.
schools. Can you talk about that so well? It's such a great message.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so just briefly on kind of our journey, my kiddos were in the public school system in Colorado up until the pandemic. And the teachers and the educators and everybody there was
Mm,
fantastic. Like, I cannot sing their praises highly enough. When the pandemic happened, everybody transitioned into the online schooling. My kiddos were in uh, preschool and second grade.
mm,
And so we tried online and it was a disaster. My son, who is very kind of a pleaser kind of personality, wants to do well, um, was trying so hard to attend to his classes online and do all these things, and he just couldn't do it. And then my daughter, like, was just like, I will show up for the morning song, and then I will show up for the afternoon song, and that's it. I'm not going to sit here and I couldn't blame her. She was little,
mm,
and so we ended up pulling out and doing homeschooling And there are a ton of other neurodivergent families just in our area, and I'm sure across the country and the world, who have pulled out to homeschool their kids. And sometimes that's because of the pandemic situation, like we did. But often it's because they cannot get the supports that they need through the schooling system. Sometimes there's just not funding for it. Sometimes educators or principals or superintendents are not educated about what support should look like. And so are not offering things that are actually going to be helpful to kiddos. Sometimes they're requiring sometimes they're not being ADA compliant, like frankly, like they're just requiring stuff that shouldn't need to be required to get the supports that kids
Mm.
need. And so parents get frustrated or don't have the money to fight back or whatever and end up pulling their kids out and homeschooling or doing some other kind of alternative schooling. And this is really tricky because in the independent sense, like my kids are doing better homeschooling than they would be doing in conventional schooling, even now that we're after COVID. Um, my kids have significant anxiety. They were feeling very stressed at school. They were having meltdowns, tantrums, overwhelm. Um, they were having stress over not being able to keep up with their peers. Um, None of that is actually factual, but their internal experience of the school environment was very negative for them. So we pulled our kids out of school. But there are probably still lots of other kiddos in that school and in others around the country who are neurodivergent or otherwise disabled who are not getting the supports they need
Mm.
either. And if those of us with the privilege and the money and the time to hire advocates and craft emails and do all the things we do, um, are kind of withdrawing ourselves from the public school system, then we end up with a public school system where people don't have the education or the resources or the push to support neurodivergent and disabled kids. And that means the school system is weaker for all the kids in the whole country, as opposed to just for ours. And so it was a really sort of morally challenging decision for me personally, because my goals as a neurodiversity advocate is to support all neurodivergent people, including our children. And it's important that they have access to good schooling. They're going to contribute to the society the same way everybody else is. Um, so for me to pull my own kids out felt very like privileged white person who's just going to opt out of the
Mm.
system. But at the same time, my children were being actively harmed by attending that school environment. And it wasn't going to be an easy thing to fix. And so I sort of settled on this middle ground of I'm going to continue to advocate and I'm going to try to educate the school systems around me and I'm going to offer resources to other neurodivergent families in my community. But I'm also going to homeschool my kids. But it's a really tricky situation and not an easy thing to fix. Yeah.
Certainly not. And you make a point, like you mentioned before, that the teachers have the best intentions. They work hard.
Oh, it's not a teacher
Right.
problem.
It's
Yeah.
more of
Hmm.
administration, it's more of money allocation, it's more of this kind of issue.
Yeah, I find that often when I talk to people, it seems like a top-down issue
Mm.
that, the way that school district budgets
Right.
work is real weird and obscure and tricky. So even getting funding for small things can be really challenging. We can say, oh, teachers need more education. Teachers have 87 other things to do that day and are not paid enough and have all these other issues associated with their job anyway. And so the sort of quote unquote easy things we could do, like train teachers, it's like, well, who's going to pay for that? Where's the teacher going to find the time?
Right.
Is the teacher also getting a para in the room or
Mm.
other support people in the room? Is the teacher even getting like paid lunch breaks, or prep time, which they're probably not. So asking them to go more trainings isn't necessarily going to solve the problem. It's really the whole system of schooling uh, ideally needs an overhaul in many ways, right? Not just around disability, but around, race and around lots of other kind of issues. But we're just, until we can actually do that, little bits like training the administration, supporting um, local bills in your area that divert more funding to schools, that divert more funding to specific projects that will support disabled kids, um, being active in your PTA. These are all things
Mm.
that you can do to make an on the ground difference for those kiddos until the whole system can be updated, really. Yeah.
Yeah, you said a mouthful there, and you, you
I do that a
yeah,
lot.
and you talk about you know, parent child relationship with autism, and you
Mhm.
had a couple of phrases in your podcast that it's the first time I heard them, and I actually had to pause and try to understand what you meant. One was misattunement, and the second one
Mhm.
was rupture and repair.
Yeah, I can talk about those. So these are, I will just say, these are not
Right.
mine. They are from sort of general psychology. So I'm a parent coach as part of what I do. And so I work with clients who are parents of neurodivergent kids or who are neurodivergent parents of non
Mm.
neurodivergent kids. So often, like you were talking about with your partner's son, Nolan, there's a communication gap, right, between how autistic brains tend to communicate. Not everybody's the same, and how non-autistic brains tend to communicate, right? And you mentioned sarcasm, which is I love sarcasm and I'm pretty okay at it. But if you get me when I'm tired in the evening, I just look at you like a dead fish. I'm just like, what are you trying to tell me? I do not get it. It takes some energy for me to interpret it
I see.
properly. And so whenever you have a relationship between a parent and a child where there's communication differences,
Mm.
just natural differences in the style of how folks are communicating, you can have more disagreements or more misunderstandings. You're trying to tell your kiddo, hey, could you do this for me? And the kiddo is hearing like, you'll be terrible if you don't do this for me, right? And has a fit about it, and you're just sitting there going like, oh, I just asked you to bring your clothes up the stairs. Why is this a big deal? And the kiddo is feeling like, you know, something has been threatened or
Mm.
some terrible thing has happened. And that kind of thing can happen pretty commonly in parent-child relationships when folks have different neurotypes, and probably when folks have the same neurotypes, frankly. And so a lot of what we do in parent coaching is really look at building a trusting relationship where both the child trusts the parent, but also the parent trusts the child, that we need to both be approaching the relationship with openness and with curiosity and with the idea that we're both on the same team and we're both going to make decisions and move forward in the world together. And so around that is this idea that we need attunement, right? We need to understand our child's motivations, goals, and kind of internal values. And ideally, we want our child to understand our motivations, goals, and internal values. And when we're attuned, we both understand each other relatively well, our communication is going to be better because we can frame our asks around that kind of deep internal knowledge of each other. When we're misattuned or have misattunement, depending on how you like to say it, it means that one of us is sort of on the surface level,
Mm.
right? We're not like deeply understanding the other person. And this often happens just from normal things in life, like you're rushing or, you need to do something, you have other things on your mind, your priorities are elsewhere than in the relationship. And that can be really common and really reasonable in a lot of circumstances. But then you need to come back and say, okay, what's my priority in the relationship first? How can I put the relationship with my child above getting to the store on time or getting to school pickup on time or whatever, which is hard
Mm.
and challenging. So when you make a mistake, we call that rupture, right? I rushed us to the grocery store because I had to get the thing on time, and now my kiddo is having a meltdown, right? We broke their trust that we're going to put the relationship first,
Mm.
which happens sometimes and is sort of normal life, unfortunately. And so what we have to do then is repair the relationship. We come back, we apologize, we say, you know, I hear you that it was really upsetting that I rushed you this morning and that you really didn't like it and it made you feel whatever you think the child is feeling. And, how can we fix it? How can we make a plan for next time so it goes better? Right. And you're restoring trust in that relationship and telling the child that you're going to put them first and put the relationship first, right? Um, and in doing that over and over and over and over again, you eventually get a family dynamic where everybody trusts one another and is more likely to understand when something goes wrong or when we rush or when we make a mistake, right? They're less likely to kind of blame and more likely to say, you know what, mom made a mistake. She's just a person. That's okay. I'm going to talk to her about it later, but I don't need to make a fuss about it now because there's trust there that you're going to be able to talk about it later and it's going to be fine.
Mm.
Right. So, yeah, I know that was a big,
I
long
loved it.
spiel. So, what questions do you have?
Yeah, very important concepts to understand. I'm not in that world, so they were new to me,
Mm,
and you do a great job. And like I say in the podcast, explaining it, and that really summarized it well. Is ADHD often
mhm.
overdiagnosed?
We have mixed research on that. What it looks like right now, as far as I understand, as again, not a statistician, but from the studies I've read, what it looks like is that it is often diagnosed in white boys in America, often underdiagnosed in women, girls, and people of
Hmm.
color in America. So Black populations, Hispanic populations, underdiagnosed. And so it really depends where you are and what's going on. Yeah.
And I wonder why that is. Do you have any theories?
There's some research around it. For the underdiagnosis pieces, the same kind of problem we have with the autism studies we have with the ADHD studies, which is that until recently we didn't have any study cohorts or populations that included non-white boys.
Mm.
So non-white, non-boys. So people who are Black or Hispanic, especially who are a huge amount of the population in the United States, or girls who tend to portray traits of ADHD differently than boys do. Sometimes not, sometimes so. So it's easier to see ADHD in white boys based on the types of tests we have now. So when your clinician evaluates you for ADHD, they're using a test that's really targeted towards white young boys. And so if you're a woman or an older person or Black, you might not um, be seen as having ADHD based on that test, even though you do. That's one thing. The other thing is that there is a large number of Black, Hispanic, and other people of color in the United States, uh, people who are rightfully scared of the medical system and of being targeted
Mm.
unfairly by the medical system, who have a history of being targeted unfairly by the medical system. And so many, especially Black and Hispanic families, we have research on them especially, are don't have the education around ADHD, aren't being taught about what ADHD looks like, and are more likely to put it down to a discipline problem with the child. And also will often be um, unwilling to talk to white doctors and white
Mm.
practitioners and white social workers about the issue. And so are just not getting the information they need. And so there is a bigger push, as far as I understand, to get more, Black and Hispanic social workers and doctors and medical professionals trained and moving, psychiatrists, to work within those communities so that trust can be rebuilt. But as far as I'm concerned, you can't really blame them for that. And there is a fear of over medication in those communities
Mm.
as well. Um, we also see racism playing a huge part where, say, you're a young Black boy child and you have some ADHD traits, which means you yell a lot and you run around a lot and you throw things.
Mm.
You might be put down racistly as just being a like aggressive young Black
Right.
man, right? As opposed to being a young boy with ADHD, who might benefit from some support. And so a doctor, even doctors who are well educated, we see in the research will often not, um, will perform racistly without meaning to.
Mm.
Like racism is in us, right? You have to actively counter it, and so certainly more work needs to be done there as well. Yeah, did I answer your
You
question?
did very effectively
Okay.
as usual. Is ADHD, is that under the neurodivergence umbrella?
Generally, yes, because we do see differences in brain function. Again, not good or bad. There's no
Of
perfect brain.
course.
We're not like trying to compare brains. But ADHDers do process different information, like they have different sensory processing, and some hormone processes are different, and so the brain function is different. We also see ADHDers have a lot of what we call executive dysfunction, which just means that the little office assistant in your brain who organizes your schedule and helps you plan and all that kind of thing isn't as effective, might need more support around that. And ADHDers have what we call time blindness, which means that they don't notice time passing the same way that non ADHDers
Mm.
may. Again, this is a big general statement, right? There are ADHDers with and without all these things that I'm talking about, but it's a tendency to see different ways of managing time or understanding time or feeling time pass. So,
When there's somebody that has autism and
mhm,
they're excelling in the business industry, or they're doing really well, like Mark Zuckerberg, we hear this. I don't know
mhm.
if there's official diagnosis or not, and there's some others. Does the autistic community celebrate that?
Again, it's mixed.
Mm,
I know when Elon Musk
Musk.
came out and said he was autistic, a lot of folks were like, "Woohoo! Like richest, one of the richest people
Yeah,
in the world is one of us." And a lot of people were like, "But he's awful!" Like just from a social justice
I
perspective and
see.
ethics perspective, he's causing harm. He's doing this, whatever. So there was a lot of criticism, but also a lot of celebration. And I feel like most of kind of whether it's a business
Mm.
person or sort of a celebrity, anybody who has a lot of attention on them comes out quote unquote as autistic or uh, shares a diagnosis. Um, there's also just the fact that autism is still really misunderstood by general society, and so when you have somebody who's controversial, a controversial public figure who comes out and says they're autistic, um, a lot of us worry about how that's going to feed into future stereotypes of autism, if that makes any sense. So all I was going to say is that whenever there is a sort of new autistic celebrity or business person or somebody with a lot of social attention, um, there's so much negative stereotype around autism specifically, like less so with ADHD and some other neurodivergences, right? But autism people really don't understand. And so whenever there's a new um, person who's going to focus attention on autism and autistic people, I think a lot of autistic folks worry about how that's going to affect the stereotype of autism. And so whenever you have somebody like Elon Musk, who's highly controversial, like regardless of what you think about him, I think we can agree that there's people who are
Love and
really
hate.
behind him and his work, people who are really not behind him in his work. Um, since he's joining a very small group of known autistic, people, anything he does can now be linked to being autistic,
Ah,
right? So there's not it's not like anyone who gets a cold is suddenly I'm trying to think of an example, right? Like people perceive of autism as being already we have all these stereotypes around autistics not being able to communicate, autistics not having empathy, autistics being bad parents, like all these stereotypes that are really harmful. And so whenever you get a controversial figure who's identified themselves as autistic, a lot of us worry about how they're going to affect those. Are they going to improve those negative stereotypes, or are they going
mm,
to like seem to lend credence to bad stereotypes around autism, right? And I think Elon Musk is a particularly good example of that because he does sometimes seem to show some of those traditional kind of bad stereotypes of autism, even though we know now research wise that those aren't related to autism at all. They're related to other personality traits, right? um, but is he going to make everyone else who's autistic, is he going to make everyone else think that we're like him,
mm.
right? For better or worse. So there's a lot of stress I think associated with that in the autism community, and people on both sides of the equation. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I didn't consider the kind of baggage that would carry.
Yeah, that's a great way to say it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, a lot of
yeah. A
baggage.
lot of
Hmm.
baggage there because any person is they're gonna have people who love and people who hate, and
Hmm.
if they do something good, hooray, and if they do something bad, well, that's because of this. And we should also talk about
Yeah.
stemming. So, Nolan does
Yeah.
stem, sometimes he kind of
Hmm.
jumps and kind of flails his arms a bit and, we'll
Hmm.
be in public and I'm so used to it, doesn't mean anything to me. And you could tell sometimes people around are not, used to that. And, you know, it can be difficult, but again, it's just something we should accept and we should just learn that that's part of his makeup.
Hmm. Yep, completely agree with you. I think that it's better than it used to be. That we, especially now that a lot of us work from home, it's more accepted to like get up and get a drink
Mm,
or walk around or fidget with a fidget cube or Rubik's cube or one of those little things. Um, but so stimming stands for self stimulation, and it's a really important piece of neurodivergence for a lot of us. And it basically allows us to regulate our nervous system. So a lot of us who are, and again, this is a huge statement because neurodivergent people are like all kinds of different
sure.
people, right? But especially I can narrow it down to say ADHDers and autistics and a couple other types of folks tend to self-regulate because our nervous systems um, are wired to get upset more
Hmm.
often, basically, to be overstimulated by light, by noise, by certain textures, by vibrations, by the weird noise your fridge makes that you don't even notice, but I notice it,
Mhm.
and I've been listening to it for 10 minutes and it's making me really stressed. So self-stimulation is a way to regulate some of that stress. And so some of us like shake our hands is a typical one. Some of us rock. One of my kids like used to bang her head into the crib and we had to get a different
Uh,
mattress so that she wouldn't bruise her forehead. So sometimes, and it's not intentional self-harm, but sometimes it can look like scratching, right? Or something. So we have to redirect the stim into some other type that's not going to bother. A lot of like I can say my co-parent who's ADHD clicks his pen, futzes with like anything he's holding. He can't not hold something. He must pick something up and futz with it
hmm.
while he's talking, or he can't maintain the conversation. And that's pretty common. And so I think there's a lot of ways that we've been able to make it more um, accessible and also more normalized by society. When those fidget spinners came out a couple of years ago and they were in every classroom and people really started to understand like, oh, fidgeting is a thing that we're allowed to do that can be beneficial. That kind of helped a lot. um, but it's important to, I really appreciate you letting your kiddo stim because it's really important and it's something that we used to sort of shut down. You had to sit straight, you had to keep your hands in your lap, right? And you weren't allowed to futz or do any of that that would help you stay calm and regulated. So
Yeah, and it's just again, it's not bad or good. It's just different. I remember we bought him a laptop computer, and it was from a particular manufacturer
mm-hmm.
that has a red kind of button in the middle of the keyboard that you could use as a, and he
Mm.
could not handle that red and the
Oh
black
yeah.
keyboard. He could not use
Mm-hmm.
that computer.
Yeah, yeah. Colors can really scatter some of us. Different of us are different. My son and I are both autistic, right? We both have the same diagnosis. Our processing systems are completely
Really?
different. I do not have hardly any working memory. I can't hold for visual stuff. I can't hold visual information for my in my head for more than like a microsecond. It just
Wow.
goes. So if I look at something and then I look away, whatever I was looking at before is probably
Wow.
gone. I might be able to tell you what it was, but that's only because I've labeled it with a word. And I'm like, okay, I was looking at the computer, but I can't think of the computer in my head anymore. My son can remember pictures in his head for days.
Wow.
Like even if it was just the briefest little inkling of we drove past something really fast and he'll be like, "Hey, that that house had their fan on and it was spinning and the fan was yellow." And it's like we drove past that house. He had like no time to interpret that in his brain and his brain somehow did it. And so yeah, our systems can be really really diverse. But we both have that sort of heightened response to visual stimuli. So we both get overwhelmed by visual stimuli really quick, but he can process it and I can't in very different ways. So it's really interesting. Yeah.
It
I
is
get
interesting.
excited about stuff like
Yeah.
that.
It's opened up a whole, it's just again how we can seem to be different, but yet we're still all the same. We
Hmm.
still essentially want love,
Yeah.
we want security, we want
Hmm.
friendship, we want it's amazing. We're just we're much better together. On the podcast, Danielle, we talk a lot about discipline. I lost a lot of weight when I was starting my
Hmm.
business. I got really heavy. I wasn't paying attention. My doctor told me if I don't lose the weight, I'm not going to see my daughter graduate. And I
Hmm.
lost 130 pounds over about a year or so. People always ask me how I did it, and I always say discipline. I don't. There's no there's no
Hmm.
magic bullet or anything. I wonder how discipline plays a role in your life, Danielle.
Yeah. I will say that I would not have considered myself disciplined at all before I got my
Hmm.
diagnosis because everything was hard. Everything was It was hard to remember to eat. It was hard to go to work on time. I couldn't work 40-hour weeks because I got overstimulated and crashed when I got home. Um, Even basic day to day, like getting dressed, doing the dishes, whatever, it was really hard. Um, and when I got the diagnosis, I was able to, we talked about a little bit before, make specific changes through the education I was getting, the resources I was getting, and kind of learn what supports I needed, right? What scaffolding I needed so that I could do basic things like eat and sleep and drink and, get dressed in the morning and those kinds of things. And now that those basic um, needs are met, my discipline is top notch. It's like the best it's ever been in my life. I can reliably get things done. I've developed systems to get things done. A lot of that comes down for me. Sorry, a lot of that comes down for me and for many of my clients to reducing our executive function issues. And so I said very briefly, right? Executive function is the very front part of your brain right here. Um, Executive function includes being able to plan ahead, being able to organize information, being able to think in blocks. What else is in there? Um, there's a whole bunch of that. See, I still have weak executive functioning because I'm having trouble thinking of any of them. Working memory, like I said before, being able to hold information in your head for a short period of time until you can put it somewhere that is usable, you can use it, all that kind of stuff. And mine is not great. I have pretty poor executive function, and that really impeded my ability to be
Hmm.
disciplined. Because you can say like, "Oh, I'm going to get up and go to the gym at 5 in the morning every day," and you can set the alarm and whatever. But if you don't actually set yourself up so that like, how am I getting dressed in the morning? How am I eating food in the morning? How am I getting to the gym? What am I going to do when I get there? What's the gym going to look like? What if it's too loud in there? What if like there's too much people? What do I do? How am I going to get home from the gym? There's all these little bits, right? That can get in the way of what seems like just a discipline issue of getting to the gym. And what I see with clients over and over again is like their discipline is not really the problem. It's the stuff leading up to the task, right? So they want to do the task. They're highly motivated to do the task. They know it's important to their life. They have this goal. They really want to get there, but there's something in the way that reads as so small that they haven't even thought to solve the problem. And once we like really narrow in on what's the little thing that's stopping you from going to the gym, is it your smoothie isn't set up in the morning? Is it your alarm is going off too late? Is it that you don't know where your shoes are because your house is a disaster? Like, what is
Hmm.
it, right? And once we can figure that out, discipline just snaps in. So I kind of have this, I think, interesting relationship with discipline where it's like, I think it's really important. I think you need to learn to do it. There's a process for developing discipline in yourself. But in my case, a lot of folks have plenty of discipline and are just being kind of like stopped before they even get to execute on their discipline, you know? So, yeah, that's my perspective on that.
That's absolutely wonderful. And it's amazing to me that you didn't see yourself as disciplined until you got that diagnosis. That's amazing. And once that
Yeah.
happened, it's just a trigger it flipped.
Yeah, because you can't be disciplined if you can't even like all those things I was saying, like, if you can't eat in the morning or find your
Right.
shoes or remember to brush your teeth, or you want to brush your teeth, but the toothbrush makes your ears hurt, like, yeah, you're not going to be disciplined about brushing your teeth, right? You need to solve these problems before you can create that discipline for yourself. So,
Absolutely amazing. Danielle Sullivan, what motivates you?
oh gosh, so many things. I think in the broadest sense, I am highly motivated by trying to make the world better when
Hmm.
I leave it than it is right now. Um, and as one person, you're limited in how you can do that, right? And so I've decided to try to approach that through uh, supporting as many folks as I can to solve problems and get to where they want to go, to be able to get to the point where they use their discipline through the work I do as an advocate. Um, but I think working on social justice initiatives is my main purpose for being here and why I exist, frankly. And that's what I hope to have achieved by the time I'm leaving this plane, is to have made some small difference in the lives of people and to have taught my children and anybody else I come in contact with that I can about, you know, the fact that we are all here to support each other. We're not going to get anything done unless we work together on it. So
Absolutely wonderful sentiment. And that's it. You speak that in volumes through your podcast, by the way. You do such a
thank you.
great job.
I'm glad to
You
hear
do
it.
such a great job. Do not stop and continue what you're doing. How do you measure success?
Oh, well, I have so many thoughts. I'm trying to choose one. Um, Here's what I do. I try to find actual stats for success because what I
Hmm.
find is that most people set themselves up for, if I do not achieve 100% of the time, I'm a failure. And achieving 100% of the time is not like it's not a reasonable goal. And so to set up for success, I think you really need to be I really focus on that part of the SMART goals. Is it reasonable? Can you do it? Because you might be really successful hitting your goal 40% of the time. And that's like, you have to honor that and be with you in that, right? Um, so I guess the way I measure success varies, but I try to set goals that I can achieve, because otherwise, what is the point? You know, how are you going to reach farther if you can't even get to your first step, right? And so be reasonable when you're setting goals. Like, it's okay if the reasonable goal set is brush your teeth in the morning or achieve 40% of your to-do list. Like, that's
Mm.
okay. You're not going to ever get to 100% if you don't start little. So that's the best I can do. I hope that's helpful for somebody out there.
Oh, I'm sure it is. It's I can't say enough great things, Danielle Sullivan. I mean, the podcast is when you accepted this, I got very excited. I'm close. I live close to the autism community with my, like I said, my
Mhm.
girlfriend's son, and I want to understand more,
Yeah.
and I want people who are listening to understand more. How can we get in touch with you? Tell us about the podcast. Tell us also about your great Patreon that helps you fund some of this.
Thanks so much, Joe. Yeah, so I run the Neurodiverging Podcast, and you can stream it wherever you get your podcasts, on Apple and Spotify and all the things. You can also check out my website, which is neurodiverging.com. We're a coaching practice, so we offer coaching support for neurodivergent individuals, their families, their kids. But we also have a lot of really good resources and articles and like how to's, right, for families who are or individuals who are struggling or who need support. And you can also always email me. My email's on the website. I'm happy to direct you to things. So that's fine. I do run a Patreon at patreon.com/neurodiverging. It is a resource for me to fund low income coaching clients. And so when you support the Patreon, you support my ability to make the podcast, and you support autistic folks who are maybe on disability or SSI or who otherwise don't have a way to work right now, to receive coaching support so that we can help them advance in their goals, often into the workplace, so that they can pass on uh, that coaching support to other folks through those scholarships. And so your support through the Patreon is really appreciated. It goes to a good place, and I'm so grateful for my patrons who have been with me on this journey. It is magic that they are there. So, and it's really fun in there. We have a Discord. I do little like coaching videos. We have chats. We do all sorts of things. So you should come join us. It's really a good place to be.
Well, I most certainly will. I encourage anybody listening to do as well. Danielle Sullivan, an absolute pleasure. I wish you continue success. Please do not stop what you're doing. I love the podcast. I love what you do. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me, Joe. I really appreciate
You
it.
be well. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you for listening and or viewing Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. Please share this episode with one or two of your friends who you think may benefit from the episode. Our website, www.joeypins.com. There you find lots of resources and you could join our mailing list. Please follow us on all our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Podcast information, the video version of our podcast is on YouTube. Please subscribe. Audio is on all major podcasting platforms. Please follow them. And if you like it, please consider giving 5-star rating. Would really appreciate that. Would you like to financially support the podcast? You can go to our Patreon site. Consider $5, $10, or $20 a month. There's all kind of plans that we have there. There's like a one-time payment. What is this podcast episode worth to you? $25, $50, $100, $500, $1,000, $5,000. You be the judge. You can go to our PayPal account to do that as well. Thank you again for listening or watching Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations.